This week, I'm going to share our most valuable tips in building epoxy tables successfully. And you guys do want to stick around till the end to see how the final product came out. Starting off this week's project, I am going to share our most valuable tips and tricks with you so you can build epoxy tables successfully. In this video, I'm going to show you the methods we take on a daily basis building epoxy tables that we taught ourselves over the past few years, and I'm going to share our knowledge with you so you will also be able to build epoxy tables. So starting off with the first tip, and the most important tip in manufacturing epoxy tables, is to make sure that the wood you're going to use are going to be dry. And there's a few ways you can do this, but we use a moisture meter, and the moisture content in your wooden slab needs to be under 11%. If it's not going to be under 11%, you're going to have massive issues down the line, which obviously is going to result in tables that's going to warp, tables that's going to crack. The epoxy is going to delaminate from the wood, and that's all the stuff that you don't want when you're going to manufacture epoxy tables using wet wood. The second tip I want to share with you guys is something also very important. And before you're going to cast your epoxy, you're gonna have to remove the bark and softwood from your slab. And by doing this is you're going to use your baby grinder with a steel wire brush in removing all the bigger, bulkier pieces of bark and the softwood on the side of your slab. You want the epoxy to be able to penetrate into your wooden slab. This is super critical. And the third tip I want to share with you guys is when you plan in manufacturing your table, always make sure to build your table slightly bigger lengthwise and widthwise. We normally allow 20 millimeter. If we cut our slab down before we're going to place it in the mold, we allow for 20 mil longer, and we allow for 20 millimeters wider. So once we're going to cut our table down to its final size later on, we can cut it down to the exact size that the client requires. The next step I want to share with you guys in when you're going to use a mold to cast your epoxy in, there's obviously many types of wood you can use to cast your epoxy in, but we typically use white melamine sheet because the melamine sheet on the chipboard prevents the epoxy from penetrating into the chipboard. This is why we use white melamine. The next step I'm going to share with you guys, before you're going to place your slab into your mold, make sure to seal the inside corners of your mold with silicone. Give it sufficient time to dry. And the next step I'm going to share with you guys, before you're going to place the slab into your mold, we are using a product called ram wax. Now, this wax prevents the epoxy from sticking to the mold once you're going to remove your table from your mold. This is quite critical. I know there's a lot of people in the States that use tuck tape. We don't have tuck tape available in our country. That's why we just use ram wax. Now, I'm sure there's plenty other waxes out there that you can use that will also be sufficient. The next step I'm going to share with you guys in what you saw before I was applying the wax. I took the liberty in manufacturing a heavy duty steel table that I can adjust all the 4 legs of my table up and down. And before we're going to cast every time, we make sure that our table is level. The next step before you're going to place your slab into your mold is to make sure that it is very clean. This is super important and you don't want to miss this step. We use an air hose and we wipe it down with a cloth. So off camera, I obviously flattened my slab at the bottom with a CNC machine, and we're going to get to this topic a little bit later on, but you do want to make sure that the bottom part of your slab is going to be basically flat. We normally, depends on the thickness of the slab, we will make it flat. This will prevent you from wasting any epoxy. You want the table to sit flat on your mold. Sometimes the slabs are not thick enough. This meaning that we won't flatten the slab at the bottom 100% flat because we want the epoxy to go underneath the table so we can still have a very thick table once we're going to cast our epoxy. This is also quite crucial. The next part and the next step I want to share with you guys, once you're going to place your wooden slabs into your mold, although you did clean it with the air hose before you're going to start casting your epoxy, we normally use an air hose. In this case, our compressor was busy on the outside and we used our leaf blower to remove all the last dust particles from our table. The next step is calculating the epoxy you're going to need for your table. Now this is, I won't say an easy step, but once you start building many of these tables, it's really easy. It's a really simple calculation of length times width times height. The next step I want to share with you guys is going a little bit more into detail on epoxies. Now, there's thousands different types of epoxies out in the world. And I'm pretty sure the epoxy we're using in South Africa, you most probably not going to get it anywhere in the world. But on the topic of epoxy, we are using a deep casting epoxy, which allows us to cast up to 100 mil thick, but we don't cast 100 mil thick. We will typically cast, say, a table that's 70 mil thick. We will do 3 castings. And the reason for this is because the deep casting epoxy takes longer to cure over time. It gives the air bubbles enough time to escape in the epoxy. This is quite crucial. And when you're going to mix your epoxy, we obviously divide it into 3 batches, and the color pigments we're going to add needs to be the exact same color pigments, the amount you're going to use for your next casting to have the same color sufficient throughout your complete cast. This is quite crucial. So obviously by explaining all these tips, it's really difficult for me to go into detail on exactly how we manufacture all our tables. There's simply just not enough time for me to go into detail to show you all our methods and techniques. This is why we took the liberty in designing a Epoxy Masterclass. It's an online course, it's about 3 hours long, and it's going to show you all our methods and techniques in detail on how we manufacture all our tables. We designed this course around about a year ago, and it's really a good course for you if you want to start building tables. It's designed for your beginner woodworker, your hobbyist, your DIYer. If you want to start a company, this course is going to help you kick off, and it's the best course you will have if you want to manufacture epoxy tables. I am going to leave a link down in the description where you can find this, and check this out. I made a small ad and it's going to help you to build the perfect table. We've been building epoxy tables for many years now, and we are finally going to share all our methods and techniques with you. My name is Greg, and I am going to show you how to build the perfect epoxy table. I'm going to show you all the tools you need, exactly how to use them, and show you some tips and tricks down the line. Everyone thinks you need to cast your second layer of epoxy once your first layer has set. That's not true. You need to cast your second layer of epoxy once your first layer has become tacky. This masterclass has been designed for all woodworkers, from your beginner all the way up to your experts. Click on this video or in the description down below for more information. So all the details for this course is down in the description. We are currently busy developing a complete new website for our channel, and when this is going to be done, the price for the course are going to go up. So you do want to go and check it out before the prices are going to double. Getting back to our build, the next tip I want to share with you guys in mixing your epoxy. Mix it for around about 5 minutes to make sure your part A and your part B is going to mix very well. And this is a vacuum chamber we invested in recently, and I do have to say this absolutely changed the way we manufacture epoxy tables. It's literally removing all the air bubbles from our epoxy. This is definitely a must-have. At the start, we didn't have this, obviously. And the way I want to explain to you guys in removing all your air bubbles is cast thinner layers of epoxy. This is going to give the air bubbles sufficient time to be able to come up from the epoxy. And as you saw previously, before we're going to cast our epoxy, it's winter now in South Africa, meaning our epoxy batches in the morning when we get to the shop is not so in a liquid form. It's a thick liquid, and we will take a bucket with water, we will warm the water, and we will place our epoxy batches in the water, and we will give it time to heat up. This will also help you to remove most of your air bubbles in your epoxy. This is quite crucial. And once you're going to cast your epoxy, we will typically wait 1 to 2 hours. Then we will come with our gas torch over the epoxy to remove most of the air bubbles. It's quite crucial because you don't really want air bubbles in your epoxy. And the next tip I want to share with you guys in when you're going to cast your next layer of epoxy. This is a question we get a lot of the time. Now, the way we've done it previously, way back in the time, we will cast a layer of epoxy, we will wait for it to dry, and then we will come with our sander and we will sand and scuff the epoxy up to make sure that the next layer of epoxy we're going to cast is going to stick to our first layer we casted. But we stopped using this method because I believe we will wait for our epoxy, the first layer we casted, we will wait for it to become tacky, like a sticky toffee type of substance. This is quite crucial because I believe that's going to give you the best bond between all your layers. Now, I know this is one of the most comments we get in posting these videos is people saying that how can this be DIY if I'm using this big fancy CNC machine. So just to give you guys some background, we are still a very small woodworking company, and this means that we don't own a CNC machine. CNC machines are really expensive. And the way we are still doing it after many years of building epoxy tables, we found a supplier close to us that has a CNC machine, and we pay him an hourly rate to flatten our tables for us. CNC machines are really expensive, and I also want to point out to every single person that leaves bad comments on the channel saying that how can this be a DIY build if I'm using all these fancy tools and big CNC machines. You guys don't know where I came from. We started this channel a few years ago out of our garage using limited tools. You technically only need 3 tools to manufacture an epoxy table. You're going to need a sander, you're going to need a track saw, and you're going to need a router. You don't really even need a router, but you need a router. All the other tools we didn't have before when we started manufacturing epoxy tables. We blended tools from other guys just to start off with our journey. And as your journey is going to progress, you're going to see you are going to upgrade your tools and you're going to buy better tools as time goes by. And we are in a fortunate position that we started this DIY journey out of our garage. And not long after, this whole thing picked up and we started manufacturing bigger tables. We started manufacturing more tables. And not long after, we started a company manufacturing bespoke, handcrafted, luxurious, exclusive furniture. So for all those leaving bad comments, I'd rather not say something bad, but the whole aim for this channel is to teach other people, is to learn from us. And I want to share our knowledge and our methods with you, so you will also be able to build these tables. So I hope I can clear this up, and I hope you guys that's leaving bad comments will stop with that, because we are really working hard behind the scenes in showing you all you guys the methods and techniques we're using, so you will also be able to learn from us. And I just want at the end of the day that everyone has to be able to build these tables. I want to share our knowledge with the world. So getting back to our build. Once we have our table back in our shop, we are going to sand all the CNC lines the CNC machine made with our belt sander. Now, I typically don't like using the belt sander, but we were pushed for time on this project because the belt sander is removing a lot of material at once, and I don't like it so much. We will typically start with our Rotex, and the reason why we want to remove the CNC lines from our table is the next step. And this is another tip I want to share with you guys. Because the wood is so dry, some places it's porous, there's a lot of places there's cracks and holes we have to fill. And we're going to do this by applying a very thick coat of epoxy over the complete surface of our table. This is to close all the small little imperfections, all the small little holes and cracks in our table, because you want to give the client what they paid for. They're paying really expensive money for this, so you want to make sure it's absolutely perfect. And the epoxy we're using for this step is not the same epoxy we use to cast our complete epoxy table. This is more of a quick set epoxy. It takes around about 5 to 6 hours to set, but because we are casting it in a thinner layer, it will take around about 24 hours to set. And you do want to come back every hour if you're going to apply the epoxy over your table, because the small little cracks and holes are going to continue to penetrate the epoxy. It's going to soak up the epoxy. So if you want to do this step, I will recommend doing it in the mornings while you're at your shop or at your home, so you can continuously check that those cracks and holes are going to be filled. This is quite crucial. And the reason why we are not only closing the cracks and holes in, if the overlapping epoxy is going to leave a stain on your wood, this is why we're basically staining our complete surface of our wood. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff I can teach you guys, and this is literally the best way, because we also want the epoxy to penetrate slightly into the wood to help it seal the wood long term. This is quite crucial. The next step I want to share with you guys is something that's also important and something you don't want to miss, is that there's a ton of comments of people asking me, do we do the same steps on the underside of the table? And yes, you do have to do it. Don't leave your table on the underside unfinished. Like I mentioned, the client is paying premium prices and you want to give them the perfect product. This is quite crucial. The next step I want to share with you guys is something I mentioned at the start of our video, is that build your table bigger lengthwise and widthwise. As you can see now I can cut my table down to the exact size the client requires. And by starting with one long edge of our table, we're going to cut our first edge square, then we're going to move to the other long side of our table. This is going to help us to have a perfectly square table. Once your longer sides has been cut down to its final size, we're going to move to the shorter sides of our table. And we've got the square we hook onto our track. We also got from Festool in helping us cutting a perfect 90-degree angle. Next tip I want to share with you guys is use the right blade for the finish cut. Use a finishing blade. This is quite crucial, and we used the wrong blade once before, and you'll see that it's going to chip out and tear out the epoxy, and you're going to have a hard time covering that up. So use the right blade for this step. Next step I want to share with you is something a lot of people ask me, is how do we fasten our steel bases to the underside of our tables? And it's quite simple. We use threaded inserts. Don't use self-tapping screws, because it's a very cheap way if you want to build expensive furniture. Use threaded inserts. We will typically start by drilling a 12mm hole, and you'll see I got a small little masking tape on my bit to make sure I'm not going to drill too deep. Then we're going to drill a small countersink hole to make sure once we're going to add our threaded insert into our hole that it's going to sit flush. Simple as that. So this is a mistake I made, and basically the underside of the table, the CNC machine wasn't set to the correct speed, and we had the small little tear out holes the CNC machine made. Luckily for us, this was on the underside, and to fix this step we used a little bit of clear epoxy to add it into the small little tear out holes the CNC machine made. We didn't really want to leave it this way, because what if the client for some reason had to check the underside of the table? We wanted to give him a perfect table. So once we added that epoxy into that small little tear out holes, we used our gas torch to make sure it physically goes into the cracks and holes. So this was the top side of our table. Once we sanded it down, we still had a few, I mean like 7 or 8 small little cracks that the epoxy didn't go into that small little cracks and holes. And we were pushed for time on this project, and this is a new thing I'm going to try, and I had to say it did work. We used a quick set epoxy from Gorilla. They claimed it takes 5 minutes for the epoxy to set. We experienced that it takes a little bit longer than 5 minutes, but I do have to say, if I could go back and try this method again, I will definitely not do it. For some reason it did work, but for some reason I don't like this technique. I will just go back and close that small little cracks and the last holes with the epoxy we used previously, and rather wait that extra day for the epoxy to set. For some reason the epoxy did set quickly, but for some reason I didn't like this product too much. Don't ask me why, we just didn't like it. The next part in our project is giving our table a small 45-degree chamfer right around. And this is another question we get a lot, is people ask us what router bits are we using. We're just using a plain straightforward 45-degree chamfer bit with a very small chamfer, because we want to keep the thickness of the table. That's quite crucial for us. So we will give it just a slight chamfer right around with our Festool palm router. And the tip I want to share with you guys is, when you get to the epoxy section where you need to give it a small 45-degree chamfer, go a little bit slower. For some reason the router bit is not removing all the materials on the epoxy side. So we will push the router very small over the epoxy section of our table. And we will typically do this. We will sand our table down to 180 grit on top and the sides of our table. Then we will come and router our edges. Then we will continue sanding. And the sanding process for our table, there's 2 finishes. The client specifically requested he wanted a smoky finish for this table. So we sanded our table down to 400 grit sandpaper. Obviously, if you want a high gloss polish finish, you're gonna have to go up all the way to 1500 grit. And the next step is, I'm not really polishing the table here. I'm using a sheep wool buff to remove all the last dust particles from our table. I'm just giving it a quick swoop to make sure once we're going to apply the oil that it's going to be dust free. So we use a polish machine for this. We typically used just a cloth, microfiber cloth for this, but we did see that if the microfiber cloth is going to make marks on your epoxy and your oil afterwards, that marks are going to stay there. So the oil we use is called Odie's oil. And we did get a comment literally today on someone asking they used Odie's oil before, but after a long time, the oil basically looks dry. And I do have to say that we had the same issue. So we will typically start with Odie's Oil Super Duper. Now I know the tin we had there is the original Odie's Oil bottle, but we added the Super Duper into the original Odie's Oil bottle, and we added a little bit of the espresso pigment in to make it a little bit browner. So we will apply the Super Duper oil, then we will wait an hour, we will come and buff it off. Then we will come back the next day and apply the original Odie's oil to the top of our table. This is quite crucial because I believe you want to, the Super Duper just penetrates better into the wood. And just for additional protective layer, we will add the original Odie's oil to our table. And we will complete this same steps for the underside of our table. It's quite crucial. And one of the main reasons why we like using Odie's oil is we can sand our wood and our epoxy to any grit our heart desires. A lot of oils we can only sand to a certain grit, but how do you sand, say for instance, how do you sand 180 grit only on the wood? And how do you sand your epoxy to 400 grit or 1500 grit? How do you sand exactly to that line? So this is why I like using Odie's oil, because it gives us the ability to sand our wood and our epoxy down to whatever grit our heart desires. So this is why we like using Odie's oil, because we are not limited to any sanding grit, and this is literally the best oil we are using in building epoxy tables. So the oiling process will take us on one table around about 5 days. I know it's very long. So this is going to be all for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know down in the comments below if you learned something new today. And before you head out, make sure to support the channel. Make sure by liking this video, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification button so you don't miss out on any future content or projects we are going to post. You guys also do want to check out the link down in the description for the Epoxy Masterclass we've got going. Also remember, the prices are going to double soon, so you might want to go and check it out. Enjoy the final product and let me know down in the comment section below, what do you think of this table, and if there was something that you would have done differently that would make this a better project. Thanks for watching this week's project. I'll see you next week with another super cool build. Cheers, guys.